My name is Michael Cullum. That's my Twitter handle. I'm going to be up here for the next little while, so if you want to tweet any abuse or anything at me, I'm completely defenseless. I'm on the management team of a project called PHPBB, which is a forum software, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of. I also run a PHP Surrey user group. For any of you who are native to London and want to travel a little bit further, we have talks quite regularly. And I'm also a secretary of the PHP FIG, the PHP Framework Interoperability Group. You don't care about any of that. Let's be honest. You're here to listen about flags, right? So you've got a British flag, an American flag. Anyway, back to basics. So this is a conditional. It's an if statement. I think most of you in the room know what an if statement normally looks like, right? And then you have a statement. If that returns true, then you do something else, do something else. This is a really simple feature flag. If you have a variable in there and you have that set to enabled, or you have a function call in there, then essentially what you're doing is you're checking for a statement and then executing something. Now, in a lot of cases, this might not be a feature flag, but that's the very core of a feature flag. A feature flag is essentially enabling something or doing something else if you're not going to do that. So what's actually the difference between a conditional, an if statement that every single person in this room uses probably every day, and a feature flag? And we all use feature flags on a daily basis. One prime example is SwiftMailer. Who's used this before? Does everyone know what this does? Essentially, if you enable this in your Symfony configuration, what it will do is disable any delivery of emails. And that's great if you're testing locally and you happen to have a live copy of the database. If you've got email addresses from your actual clients on there and you are sending out a test email, I think it was about a year ago, I had a push notification from BBC News saying something along the lines of, breaking news, the world has exploded, Justin Bieber is dead, etc. Obviously some test message from a developer who had forgotten to set some feature flag for his local environment. Now, if you look in the SwiftMailer bundle, that code very simply translates to this. If it detects that the disabled delivery flag is set, then it will just set the transport to null. And that's your feature flag. It can be as simple as that. Essentially, this is the only bit we care about. We set a parameter just so that we're able to check it later on in an easy fashion from the container to see if we're actually delivering emails or not. And this is used in the console, for example. It's used in debug information. But that's the core of it. That very simple 2 lines. And that's a feature flag. So now that I'm done, I'm just going to leave you with that. There are much better ways to structure your feature flags. We've got an interface up here, an interface of feature flags. No, we don't. That's a function. That should say function up there. Function feature flags. That's. We'll just skip that slide. Is enabled. This is a function which you might have implementing an interface for an isEnabled function method. And it's going to return a Boolean, a yes, a true, or a false. Yes, this is enabled, or no, it is not enabled. And in this case, we hard code it to say that if the flag equals profile, return true. You might have a long switch statement here. But ultimately, this isn't the best way of doing it because you're defining all of your flags actually in your PHP code. But it's really easy to use. Just is enabled profile, and you'll find that it is, and it will execute your new profile magic. It's a little bit more complicated. But essentially, this is just going back to what we were doing earlier with SwiftMailer. We're seeing if it's enabled, and if mail delivery is, then we're getting the parameter, setting the parameter enabled, and if not, and then we're returning false as the default. You can also do it with cache. You don't have to just do it in your file with a PHP class. You can do dynamic things. So, and this is the beauty of using an is-enabled function. If you're using a function for it, then all of this is, you don't have to worry about that in your actual code. Otherwise, on every single feature flag, then you end up with all of this added complexity. With this cache, we're getting the cache. We get the item, which is the specific flag, and then we see if it's a hit. Now, what we're actually doing here is we're using it dynamically, so the sprintf, and this is what we were slightly doing back here, is we were saying, if the feature flag is the mail delivery, then we're using this specific Swift mailer enabled. But otherwise, we're seeing if there is a specific parameter in the container that's detailing what that flag is. So this S here, and that you can use that as a catch-all. Then you don't have to define in each individual file, in each individual flag in this particular file. You can just set it as a parameter and it will automatically get that from parameters, and you can hard code that in that function as well. Here you're using the cache, and you're just going from the cache and you're saying, does this exist? If it doesn't, then you can calculate that appropriately. You can go and get that from your parameters file or as such, and then you can get it. You can also store it in the database. Now, this is where the real power comes from, being able to define your feature flags in the database. Because it allows you to not just vary by environment, but also by users. So you can go on your environment, you can have a feature flag enabled locally, but you can also have it enabled in production, but also you can have it enabled per user. So for example, Spotify, I was told earlier, does this. They enable a feature in production, but they will only enable it for specific users. And this allows any administrators, developers, etc., to test in production. Now, you can use feature flags as an alternative to branching. But branching only does so much. Branching only works for environment. You can't have multiple branches running at the same time. Some repositories are monolithic. If you've got something like Flickr, so Flickr did a blog post a number of years ago on feature flags. And they realized that how you could do this properly. Because they have a huge monolithic repository, and it's simply not practical to everyone just finish all their code and push it straight up to Flickr. So they use feature flags, and they do that so that they can do both live testing and so that they can have it dependent on different environments. And finally, it solves the problem of conflicts. If you have a huge ongoing project that's going to change your code massively, you can use feature flags as opposed to branching, so the two can work in harmony. And you can work on your individual features with branching, pull requests, etc. But you can still have feature flags in there as well so that you've got that one underlying part and you're not splitting your application having those huge conflicts. You can enable it for a subset of users. Quite often, I know Facebook does this. They will roll out a specific feature to a certain subset of users. So, for example, they might roll out their graph search, which was something that came out a couple of, maybe about 4 years ago now. But it was a huge new feature that allowed really dynamic searching. So you could search for people that lived in a certain area, that went to a certain school and had a certain interest, for example, out of your friends. And they rolled that out to the United States. They then changed it hugely before they then rolled it out in the United Kingdom. And that's essentially a feature flag. It's a feature flag dependent on your individual users. A/B testing. Who does A/B testing? Quite a few of you. Are there any front-end developers in the room, actually? A couple at the front. So a lot of front-end developers do this a lot more, particularly with testing conversion rates, etc. A/B testing allows you to show a different result to different people. Similarly to showing to a different subset of your users. But if you're just showing it to a random section of the population, you can use feature flags to say, are they in this particular group or are they in this other group? And then show them a different cart, for example, or you can test out that new feature on them. Testing in production. Who tests in production regularly? I know all of those hands are slightly nervous, and then there are a few that are a bit like that, but are actually, your hand is up, isn't it? Testing in production. Testing in production is bad, right? That's what we're always told. But actually, it can be okay. Ish. Testing in production with feature flags is really important because essentially, no matter how many vagrant boxes you have, no matter how identical it is to your environment, even if you've got the exact same scale environment set up locally, if you're deploying a feature to Facebook, then you're never going to be able to replicate the entire exact same environment as Facebook with all of that exact same data, with that huge scaling, with that huge load. Feature flags will allow you to enable to deploy to production, but do it safely. So you can then enable it for yourself and say, hey, this works, just me. And you can then do that phase rollout that we were talking about. You can roll it out to the United States. If suddenly it crashes then, and you've killed Facebook, then you can just roll back and disable it for those users, keep it enabled for yourself, and work out what that scaling problem is. Particularly on highly scalable solutions, it really makes sense to be able to test in production. Test first, don't just test in production. Monolithic repositories. Who uses a monolithic repository at work? A few of you. Big corporates do this quite a lot, so Google is very monolithic, Flickr, very monolithic, and numerous other companies, I believe Spotify does this as well with feature flags. Having one repository can be quite difficult because you have hundreds of developers all working on it, each of which is currently working on a new feature. Now, if you had everyone just pushing all of their code straight up, you would introduce a lot of bugs. You might have conflicts. You might fix a conflict, and by the time you then go to push back up again, you might have new conflicts coming in. I can imagine that's a situation you might come across. So for monolithic repositories, it allows you to share your code with coworkers, but without branching. Lots of companies don't have VCSs in this quite the same way that like Git. They might. There are lots of. I think there's one beginning with P that which name escapes me. Sorry. Perforce. And for things like that, using feature flags really makes sense. One of the most powerful things about feature flags is being able to test a matrix of changes. If you're making changes to your profiling system, but you're also making changes to your profile picture system and your image renderer, then you might be working on all three of these simultaneously, and you might want to be able to test different matrices of them. You might want to test both your profile, new profile and the image rendering, but not have to worry about the profile picture because that's not quite ready yet. Or you might want to test all three at once, but before you actually merge them all together. Now, using feature flags, you can do that, whether that's through the database or through your code environment. You've got to manage your flag somewhere, and I've kind of talked a bit about this already. You can do this primarily through two ways. One way is a database. If you do it through the database, it can be significantly more powerful. Through the database, you can, with a click of a switch on a live environment, disable or enable a feature. If you're using feature flags and you're using them with your front-end developers, this might be a much more friendly way of doing it because it allows them, without having to delve into code or configuration files that they may not have too much experience with, they can go and enable and disable those features that you've spoken to them about. Or you can do it in the code using a YAML file. This is just a config.yaml file from a Symfony standard edition. Doing that allows you to version control your feature flags, which can be very useful, specifically if you want to always make sure that a flag is set in a certain way in production or locally. The disabled delivery feature flag that we were talking about in SwiftMailer, if you've got your production configuration.yaml file, you'll always want your email delivery enabled, whereas you will always want it disabled in your test environment. So that's a really important way of where you can use your code base to manage your feature flags. So I've talked about a bit about the different uses of them, but how can we use them cleanly? This is a piece of Twig. This is one way that you can use a feature flag. If you set up a Twig extension, then you can just very simply in your code have isFeatureEnabled, show CFP form, and then have your form. Now, that might be, and then that is feature enabled. It might be the fact that you have decided to start your CFP at that particular date. You might have that in a database. You might have that in you might do that in a deployment. Twig extensions. Twig extensions are really easy if you're doing them quite simply. There would be a few more lines of code, like the get name, etc. But this is essentially just the crux of it. You would just then have an is enabled, and you'd then define what is enabled is, because that's a closure. Execute your main flags, your main way of checking feature flags, and then that is accessible in your Twig templates. Feature flags don't have to just be about PHP. They don't just have to be in your Redis configuration or your configuration.yaml file for Swift mailer. You can use them in your applications too. But sometimes they get really complex. I've talked about if statements, and sometimes you do end up looking a bit like this, where you've got five different nested conditional statements there. Half of that is if the new profile feature is enabled. Now, with the bottom bit, the legacy profile, I've just taken that out. But you can imagine that there might also be many, many lines of code. And then you're getting into this huge thing where you're duplicating your code simply to have your conditional if statements. So controllers. Controllers you can do, this is a YAML configuration file for routing. With your controllers, you can actually set it to use a different controller. Now, if you're working on a completely alternative profile, for example, this completely makes sense because your code is going to be entirely different. Otherwise, you're going to have one huge controller, which is going to have one large if statement in, and then essentially have two controllers in it. But you want to only have one route. You want profile user. And you want that to work for both your new profile and your old profile. Who is, when they're working on something, use something like profile_new as the path. Yeah. So this is a nice way to be able to prevent having to do that, but without having to make your code controllers 20 lines long when they should only be 10. So here we've just got the default controller, which is our legacy. That's what it was. And then we've got our new profile, the alternative controller. And then we've defined our flag. So our flag is going to be the new profile. If that flag is set, then we can get it. We can also get our alternative. And then see if it's enabled. Once we've done that, this is an event listener on kernel request. If that flag is then enabled, we can then change the controller. This is a really powerful part of Symfony in this particular request. Essentially, on every single request, what it will do is it will execute, but it executes before the controller is executed, after the request comes in. So we can actually change this controller line from our listener inside of our listener. If the flag is enabled, using that is enabled magic, then we can just simply change the controller. We can also make this a tiny bit more complex. If you want to check, if you want to have it in such a way that you have a controller that won't exist unless they have that feature flag, you can also do this. So I've added this little bit, this code at the bottom. If we're not setting an alternate controller, but we are setting a feature flag, then we want to have that feature flag checking for something, right? So we want to have it checking if that page would be accessible. If it's not, we can throw a 404. And you can do a similar thing with factories. Profile factory. We create our profile interface. We create it. We have our profile interface is what it should return, because we want it to return the same kind of thing. We don't want to have a service and then not know which different methods it might potentially produce. If the flag is enabled, new profile, we can get it. If it's not, we can have this legacy profile. But this is very specific. This is a non-generic factory. This is all about the profile. We can simplify this and have one single flags factory. Having a create service and passing in 3 arguments. Passing in an argument for the flag, which might be new profile. Having an argument for the service, which is a default service, probably the legacy one. And having the alternate. And then if it is enabled, then we can get our standard service And if not, we can get our alternate. Who's used factories before in Symfony? Most of you. So then, very simply, we would define our service as our flags factory. And in our profile manager, we set what our factory should be, app flags factory. We want to get the user create service, and then we just pass in those 3 arguments. We pass in what our flag should be. We pass in what the 2 different controllers are, the legacy profile manager and the new profile manager. So feature flags allow you to do branching with or without conflicts or a VCS. You can, who doesn't use a version control system? Okay, a few of you, a few nervous hands. No, but I mean, so this sometimes you come across in a project, particularly if you're consulting or something, and they won't necessarily be using Git or even Subversion. So sometimes you have to be able to deal without branching, but you still want to be able to have that difference on environments and different for your users. Testing in production. I've talked about this. If you want to be able to test in production, but you don't want to test it with all of your users, which is very dangerous and would not be recommended, then you can use feature flags. That's slower rollout. The slow rollout for trying to do it for just for United States users versus British users. Again, you can do that with feature flags. Functionality on different environments, being able to enable and disable mailing is a very obvious one that most of us have used. A/B testing. Being able to enable it and disable it for a different subset of users. And you can do it cleanly. You can do it with database or configuration files, both of which give you different extensibilities. And there's no reason you can't implement both. There's no reason you can't have it both in a database and a configuration file. And you can avoid all of these really large large conditionals. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I could just imagine it becoming really unmaintainable if you start to get features which depend on other features. And if you're running functional tests, you have to run functional tests with every combination of features to make sure that when one feature is enabled, then it doesn't break another feature.
Yeah. So one really useful thing about feature flags is standard. When you're testing something by default, you are only testing your individual feature that you're working on. If you're using feature flags, then it is possible to enable that matrix of changes. And yes, you would have to be able to find a way of being able to test all different variations of that matrix if you wanted to. But ultimately, you shouldn't be using feature flags for something that should be enabled for everyone. So if you've pushed your feature to production and you're no longer doing A/B testing on it, then you shouldn't be using feature flags for that anymore. You need to make sure, that's a really important thing about feature flags, is making sure you're removing your feature flags after you've used them. So after you've finished your A/B testing, after you've finished having your difference between your different locales, or after you've finished developing that specific feature. Feature flags are really useful when you're developing things and when you're testing it on production for the first time, but that doesn't mean that you should be leaving them there once they're done. Once you've tested that on production and you know that it's safe and you've enabled it for everyone in production, you don't need that feature flag anymore. It's just serving as a useless conditional, and then you end up with those situations where, yes, you might end up having that thing. So you shouldn't be using a feature flag where you wouldn't already be having to use branching or doing something else. But what it does allow you to do is additional things like testing in production. Does that answer your question? It shouldn't be adding any complexity. It should only be adding the ability to do extra things like testing in production, or you can use it to replace branching. But you wouldn't test all of your test branches in a matrix anyway, on the different things you're working on. Any other questions? Cool.
When you're using caching, like Redis or whatever, how do you tend time will expire every feature
Yep. So if you're using configuration files for your feature flags, then generally you should only really be doing that if you're changing on different environments. So if you're changing on your local environment to, for example, the disabling delivery of emails, which I mentioned with SwiftMailer. So that kind of thing you really shouldn't be changing too often. If you're then trying to enable something in production, it's worthy of using a database to control that and some kind of simplistic admin panel, or having some way in that. Ultimately, when you're deploying anyway, then you should probably be purging your cache of your configuration files that might be changing with Redis. But you can also get it straight from the cache. So right back, roughly. I can't find a specific slide where I used. Oh, there we go. So here you can actually be getting your value directly from the cache instead of from the configuration file. Now the thing is, this may be that you're storing it to the cache and not storing it in a configuration file in the first place, and that you are simply setting that in some other way. It doesn't have to be from a configuration file. Does that kind of make sense? So I mean, you should be purging your cache of your configuration files anyway when you're deploying, if you think that those values are going to be changing on deployment. Does that answer your question?
Interested in the way you go about it. I have my own.
Okay. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
Got settings associated with feature flags. Have you got any experience of where you store those, or it's a kind of like it's a framework, but kind of methodology you tend to use?
So for storing the values of feature flags.
Yeah. So obviously a feature flag is a boolean.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need to store associated settings for that feature.
Right.
So how do you generally tend to sort that?
So it really depends on the feature flag. One thing that feature flags are bad at is if you require schema changes to your database for them to be implemented. If you're modifying existing data in the database, then feature flags won't necessarily be particularly useful in that context, because you need to be able to have the same backend that you're going to be relying on both systems, where the backend being the database. If you have a series of new, so you've got a new table in there, for example, that's absolutely fine having that, because then you're only going to be interacting with that when the feature flag is enabled. I'm not sure if I've never tried it, if there's a way of doing doctrine migrations, but only doing that if there's some sort of feature flags with doctrine migrations and stuff like that. So that might be something you could have a look into. Or I'll have a look into and get back to you if you come and speak to me afterwards. But yeah, so for schema changes and database changes, it gets more complex. Sometimes it's easier to implement that migration on the whole system. And then you're only looking at it on the front end, and then if you need to roll back, and then if you decide that actually you're going to do it differently, you'll just apply more migrations, and then you've got both of those running simultaneously in your back end. Cool. Any more questions? Yeah.
You gave us a tip about controllers and services. Do you have any tip for templating?
Templating. So in your templates, you can use, I think I meant there was a Twig extension, which is quite simple to implement, and you can just get that to then call your whatever you're using to determine whether it's a method or a class to determine if the feature flag is enabled, and then expose that function to Twig. You can also, in your controllers, you would be able to render different templates just using conditionals to check if that flag is enabled to render a different controller. It's also possible to, in your controller, in your template rather, again running a different render and rendering that from inside your controller, from inside your template, sorry. So you can do that from both within your template or your controller, depending on what is more appropriate in that particular situation. Cool. Any more questions? Okay, fab. Thank you very much.